Well, the main theme of this conference is the psychology of the person in the building. And I want to try something different and try to imagine what it would mean for the building to have a psychology. And to frame this, I just want to briefly define sort of these three levels. Psychology, I think, very generally looks at primarily human but other behavior. Cognitive science tries to get more into the mechanisms, what are the processes that make that particular psychological behavior possible. And then cognitive neuroscience says to what extent can we locate those processes in the brain. And I come to this as a neuroscientist, and I've been very much interested when we look at how neurons work together to do cognition. And recently I've become obsessed about how monkey brains, ape brains, and human brains in comparison provide us cues to think about how the human brain evolved in such a way we have language. So that's just my credentials. In other words, don't trust anything I say about architecture, but maybe you can trust what I say about the brain. So in thinking about, this is for Alexi, the view of the Opera House. In thinking about how to link architecture and neuroscience, I've come up with a three-way classification. One is what goes on in the brain of the person experiencing architecture, what goes on in the brain of the architect while they're designing, but I'm going to look at something else, which I call neuromorphic architecture. And this is the idea of what would it mean for a building to have something that, in inverted commas, we'll call a brain. Before I tell you what I have in mind for neuromorphic architecture, let me just give you a few concepts about the brain. But before even I do that, I just want to pull this up. Yesterday, Alexi told us about the Well Living Lab, which the Mayo Clinic is involved in. And what's interesting about that is that it's really to do research about, presumably, primarily medical environments and their effect on the well-being of the patients, maybe the doctors too, and the nurses. And as such, it has sensor-rich, reconfigurable space. And in a sense, my concern in this talk is with sensor-rich, reconfigurable space. But where this is space that humans are controlling as they carry out their different experiments on well-being, my concern is what if the building itself is a reconfigurable, thoughtful, cognitive, psychological entity. So, with that distinction before us, let's just quickly look at the brain. This slide just indicates the way in which different creatures not only have different bodies as we are familiar with from the outside, but their brain structure is quite different. And if we go into the fine details, not shown on a slide like this, we can see even more the relative size of subsystems changes, their connectivity changes. So I would say my obsession, I've studied frog, rat, monkey, chimpanzee, and human brains. My obsession has been to try and understand those differences and have a framework for thinking about them. And as an extreme example of the evolution of brain and body together, I introduce you. Has anybody seen this before, the star-nosed mole? The trouble with this slide is you won't remember anything else from this talk. So this creature, you can see both the very specialized effectors, the forelimbs devoted to digging through the ground, but also where you would expect a nose to be. This is not an olfactory organ, it's a tactile organ, and the idea is that it digs its way through. It can perhaps discover little creatures wiggling around that are then its prey. And what this slide shows is it compares the structure of one half of the olfactory organ with a stain in the brain where you see these particular barrels in the brain devoted to the preliminary processing of the individual figures, if you will, of the touch organ. So this is just to make the stage that I'm probably going to be talking mainly today about sort of conventional buildings, and you throw in some intelligence into the building. But down the line, as in this extreme example of mammalian evolution, the issue is how will our very conception of a building change as we begin to put more intelligence in. I mean, this is not really new in the sense that if you think about going from a house with chamber pots to a house with flush toilets, or a house with candles to a house with electricity. Clearly this has been an ongoing process, the way in which new technologies have not only replaced old approaches, but have very much change the way we lay out the building. Okay, so here's sort of the guiding thought. Neuroethology is the study of animal behavior, and so we look at the brain of the animal as it moves around a world outside. So I'm introducing this idea of neuromorphic architecture to say, what can we do in future architecture if we imagine that, yeah, the physical structure is in some sense a body, but there is a brain. I put brain in quotes because we're not going to plug in an animal's brain and hope the building works for us. And so I'm using, when I'm being more technical, the term interactive infrastructure to say this is what will allow the building to relate to the people who are moving around inside it or out on the patio or on the street nearby. So this is just to get us to think a little more. This is just a room. There's a main entrance. There's a computer room where you really don't want people to go. There's access to offices. You can imagine that there are, as we're familiar with in the surveillance society, cameras all over the place. But then there's going to be various monitoring. So one is just to recognize people who are meant to be going through to the offices or technicians who are out in the computer room, but also recognizing people who shouldn't be there. And the idea is you might imagine sort of one brain is worrying about the computer room, one brain is worrying more about just people moving through to the offices and so on. And so a general point is that we normally think of one brain in one body. If we want to have a lot of operations going on at the same time, we build a team. So the brain for a building may well be in some sense like a team. I don't know whether you know this term virtual machine. The idea is that you build a computer, but what it does can be totally different. Well, in terms of your iPhone or your iPad, if you load an app, it becomes a totally different machine. So this idea, in some sense, we, through our education, have become a certain number of virtual machines which we can switch in depending on the occasion. So the idea that the room will have this variety is part of the story. Now, nobody seems to really push this neuromorphic architecture idea, but as one looks around, one finds some things that are related. Kolarevich and Pollack from Calgary have just edited a book called Dynamic Buildings, and some people are inspired by cybernetics in the way they design it, but I'd say the emphasis there is more on the body rather than the brain. How can you reconfigure, have a building that perhaps adjusts to be more open to the wind at one time and to be closed off from the wind at another time, and doing that automatically, or things of this kind. There are also some public events where you get a lot of devices together to put on a show. But it's not really a building with a brain designed to foster human interaction. Closer to the mark, although more artificial intelligence rather than brain research, is this journal of ambient intelligence. And so I think in the future, we'll be debating, as it were, with the authors there to say, should we just go with AI, or are there real lessons to be learned from brain? But my stance at the moment is, I know a lot about the brain, so let's pretend it's useful. Okay. One of the terms that, in fact, you heard yesterday is that of affordance, and classically it's due to J.J. Gibson. And it's the idea that there are parts of your perceptual apparatus that don't necessarily involve your conscious attention, but nonetheless can guide your action. So here's La Rambla in Barcelona. You're walking along, you're staring at certain people, you're looking up at the facades of the building, and suddenly you swerve. Why? You didn't see anything that made you get out of the way. It's just the pattern of optic flow on your retina indicated there was an imminent collision. And so you automatically, subconsciously, moved out of the way. And so a lot of discussion in architecture has been, in fact, in terms of affordances, which may be a little more conscious. But if I want to get from here to the door, at the conscious level, I'm probably aware of the door. At the affordance level, I'm probably not thinking, oh, the carpet is here and it goes around there. I'm just in the background, as it were, computing that. So that's going to be very important. And then the complementary part, which Gibson's disciples came up with, is effectivities. In other words, the affordances are recognizing the possibilities for action, perhaps subconsciously. The effectivities are, well, it's no good to recognize, oh, look at that beautiful view up there, let me fly up to the top. That's not one of my effectivities. So as we begin to think of the building perhaps more as a dynamic entity, it's recognizing effectivity, it has effectivities, it's recognizing affordances for its actions. Now, recently I came upon a rather different use of the word affordance by Tonino Grafero, who was one of the speakers at this session in Helsinki about 3 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago. And he talks about architectural affordances, but the context is the discussion of atmosphere, which is more the way in which a building induces a mood. I go into one room, I feel depressed. I look at a vista, I feel exhilarated, and so on. So a building is not only having a function. A number of you here have gone into hotel rooms recently for the first time. Not the first time we were in a hotel room, I hasten to add. But you've gone into hotel rooms, and some of you will have gone in and say, oh, this is such a depressing room. Yeah, it's got a bed and a bath, what the hell. And others have gone in and said, this is a nice, spacious room, there's a view. So this idea of, in addition to what you might call the basic functionality, there is this issue of atmosphere, mood, aesthetics. My only point, I think, here at the moment is, firstly, that calling it affordance is perhaps a little unhelpful, because it's very different from Gibsonian affordance. With my brain hat on, I want to say very different parts of the brain are going to be involved. So for the lessons I'm going to get from studying the brain, for these affordances are going to be different from the Gibsonian. The other point, though, is that what would it mean for that hotel room to recognize what it is that you don't like about the atmosphere it provides and readjust itself, change the color of the curtains, impose a holographic view outside the window instead of that brick wall, etc. Let me just give you one example of a building that is not yet neuromorphic, but has some of the ingredients, but more, if you will, at the reflex level, the Institut du Mont Arbib in Paris, where we have this wall. You can see one panel on the right, the whole facade on the left, where in response to light, all of these are active diaphragms that can change. So not only adjusting the level of light in the room, there are some chairs here to spare if you prefer them to the floor. See, if this were a neuromorphic room, it would have scooted the chairs over it. But that gives us some idea of if you will, a basic reflex system that we might think of extending as we try to bring in more cognition, more psychology on the part of the building. Let me go through what I still consider perhaps the most fully developed example of neuromorphic architecture. It's now 14 years old, 2002, but this was inside a pavilion at the Swiss National Exhibition in Lausanne. Over 500,000 people walked through it. It was called Ada, the Countess of Lovelace, I think illegitimate daughter of Byron, but she programmed the computers for Babbage's difference engine back in the 1800s, so she's considered to be the first program. So here's a view of Ada, and Ada had a brain in quotes because it was based in part on artificial networks. And in a way, I'll talk about in a little moment, she had emotions and wanted to play. So this idea, we're beginning to get some idea of emotion, cognition in a building. And so the first thing is the sensors. There were both a fixed grid of cameras to monitor what was going on. There's a chair up the front here if you want it. A fixed grid of cameras, but also these gazers which could turn both to focus attention on particular visitors and to direct microphones at them to get more information. But the most important thing about this building, and in a way it reminds us of the star-nosed mole, in that it's really different from the way we think about touch, was the floor. And the floor was made up of hexagonal tiles, and the tiles were both touch sensitive and were able to emit different color lights, and they were connected so that the floor would not only know that somebody was in a particular position pulling their weight, but by being able to observe that this tile was bearing weight, then just a moment later this tile was bearing weight, it could come up with the idea of following individual visitors as they moved across the floor. And this actually served as a medium of communication because Ada could do things like give a person a particular color, and then by setting up tiles to move in a particular direction, encourage the person to move in a particular way. And in particular, Ada could begin to have some sort of an emotional interaction. Here was one person who totally ignored everything she did, and here was one person who took part in the activity that Ada was setting up. And this will lead in a moment into this form of emotion. But here are the ways in which there were various interactions. Just if all the tiles are the same color, that's just the analog of sleep. You begin to get this allocation of colors to visitors, waking up, exploring, trying to find visitors who are interesting, both using the visual response, using light beams, but also seeing to what extent they would respond to stimuli of different kinds, start moving together. And then if, in fact, she could get a group of, notice how we say she when talking about Ada, if we could get a group of visitors together, then she could play various games with them, but with 550,000 visitors, it's important that they leave eventually. So part of the game would be to eventually say, it's time to move on. So anyway, this gets us into the notion of emotions in a neuromorphic architecture. I'm advertising another book I helped edit. There is an increasing amount of work on robot emotions. And so I think we can see, in some way, a building is not only an inside-out animal, it's an inside-out robot. And so the literature on robot emotion, I think, will feed into what's going on anyway. To continue, Ada wants to interact with people. She's happy when they participate. She's frustrated when they don't. She has various emotional states. And this diagram, which I'm not going to go with through with you though, is just to say that happiness, in her case, is based on three things. Survival for her is in terms of how well is there a flow of visitors going on. Now, of course, if that was the only criterion, it would have been a very bad exhibition. I mean, you could have just had a slide that you stepped in the door and you slid to the exit, and in terms of flow of visitors, that would be very efficient, but hardly effective. So the other things were recognition, was to what extent she could recognize and track particular people, finding out who was interesting, who was engaged, and then to what extent she could interact with them. And so this diagram is just to say there was a way of coming up with the computations underlying that, which said that what Ada was doing was increasing her happiness in a way that both kept the flow of visitors going, but also engaged the visitors and made them feel they were getting a good experience as they went through. Okay, now, the good news and the bad news, well, it's just bad news. I give a course for many years on brain theory and artificial intelligence at USC, and for some strange reason, just over a decade ago, I decided to give the students the idea of take everything you've learned about the brain from my course, and instead of doing the usual exercise, come up with a computer model of this part of the brain. It was try to think about what if a room had a brain. And the general politics of what I'm saying today, and their examples are in this article, Brains, Machines, and Buildings, and I'd be happy to send you a copy if you drop me an email. I decided not to show you the actual diagrams they came up with the rooms because many of you are architects, and what little credibility I have will be destroyed if you see what computer scientists think of as the plan for a room after just a few weeks. But I will go through in terms of their principles. But let me tell you a little bit more about the brain first. I mentioned before the idea of affordances with the example of walking down the street and not thinking consciously as you move to avoid people, but rather you're keeping track of interesting people, interesting views. In the brain, my colleagues Hideo Sakata, working in the parietal lobe back here in an area called AIP, and we needn't worry about the details today, discovered that here in the monkey brain, when the task was for the monkey to reach out and pick up things, this is where the visual system was analyzing an object, not in terms of what it was, but in terms of how to interact with it. How to, do you turn your hand like this or like this? Do you have a big pre-shape or a small pre-shape? And meanwhile, Rizzolatti and his colleagues in Parma studying this F5 area in premotor cortex were finding that that area would take this information about the shape and begin to formulate the motor plan. And more as an evidence of credibility than to go through the details, we developed a very elaborate computer model of that not only incorporated the existing data but suggested ideas for a range of new experiments. But for many of you, the result you know about is what came next, which is the discovery by the group in Parma, Rizzolatti and colleagues of mirror neurons, where in that same area F5, in addition to neurons like this, which were specific to a particular type of grasp, in this case the precision pinch, and would fire every time, these are separate trials, every time the monkey was carrying out that particular grasp, they found a subset which they called mirror neurons, which also lit up vigorously when the monkey observed, in this case the human, carrying out that grasp. And unfortunately, this very important idea in neuroscience has been picked up in the popular press to the point where many people seem to think that mirror neurons are magic and do everything. So you just have to have a mirror in your room and it will be intelligent. So let me just give you one example that suggests the subtleties that we get from studying the brain in terms of trying to come up with different subsystems, with a suggestion that understanding the differences that evolution gave us in the design of different brains will give us an idea of subsystem analysis for trying to add intelligence to a room. And so Aliotti had an interesting study, just showing people videos of a throw of a basketball to a hoop. And the three test subjects were ordinary people, sportcasters, and expert athletes in basketball. And then they measured the area of the brain that in humans is thought to contain the mirror neurons, and they found just a small activation in the average person, a little bit more in the commentator, but a much bigger activation in the player. And interestingly, when they did the following, they said, now let's forget the brain scan, let's just have you look at the video, and we'll just show you the beginning of the video. Is the ball going to go into the hoop? And the players could predict with huge accuracy. Even the commentators, nervous laughter, could not. So the suggestion is that the mirror system is more engaged in coming up with the motor parameters of actions that you can imagine doing yourself, and there are other parts of the brain that have to do with the general recognition. And so in coming up with a brain architecture for a building, you have to say, is this a task where just knowing what the person is going to do is enough? It's going to be one type of brain subsystem. Here I need to know exactly where they're planning to go, what they're planning to do, and then I'm going to need a more detailed subsystem. Okay, so I'm told I have 1.2 minutes left, which is tough. So let's just say if you care to write to me, I'll send you the remaining slides. But the one aspect was what if you had a kitchen and a dining room that could assist the chef, and then we've added could monitor the activity of the diners in responding to various dishes, adjusting recipes and so on. And then slides like this are again I don't expect you to look at the slide in detail today, just to get the idea there's a different sort of plan that comes with this brain for a building approach, which is what is the neurals, what I'll call the neural space. If you're thinking in terms of the brain subsystems that the room would have to carry out its various functions, what would it be like? The second example is a secure room, and let's just look at the blue part. You're trying to figure out whether somebody should be there. So you're going to have face recognition, accessing a database, but you're also going to have trajectory recognition, and then can you figure out from their trajectory what their intention is, and maybe even following the fine details of their motion in terms of calling upon appropriate resources, whether human or robotic, to deal with the situation. Again, a neural space overview, and then I'm going to go about 2 minutes over. So the hippocampus is an area that interests us a great deal. Many of you know about HM, who had surgery for epilepsy, removed the hippocampus and quite a bit more of the brain, lost episodic memory. He could no longer remember he could no longer form new memories of events. You could talk to him, have a good conversation, he seemed perfectly fine. You'd leave the room, come back, and he'd never seen you before. But he could still, if you played a game with him repeatedly, even though he never remembered playing the game before, his skill improved. So he had procedural memory, he had working memory. So this analysis of different memory structures is again something we would bring to the table in thinking about what sort of structure we would put in the brain of this intelligent group. While John O'Keefe from University College London studied the brains of rats, and he placed an electrode in the hippocampus, and the tracery you see here is just the rat wandering around this little room. Please.
No, that works in perfect.